There is a quiet contradiction that lives in the lives of many generous people. They give abundantly to causes, to friends, to colleagues, to strangers, and yet return home to relationships that are starving. They pour into the world with open hands while the people closest to them wait for what is left over. They are celebrated for their generosity in public while privately, in the rooms where it matters most, they are absent in the ways that count. This is not a condemnation of generosity. Generosity is one of the finest qualities a human being can develop. But generosity that flows outward while the inner world, the home, the family, the self, remains unattended is not complete generosity. It is generosity with a blind spot, and blind spots, however well-intentioned, could have consequences that accumulate quietly until they are impossible to ignore. What happens when charity truly begins at home, when the care, the attention, the investment, and the genuine love that you offer the world is first offered to the people in the life closest to you, is the subject of everything that follows. If this resonates with something you already sense is true, subscribe before we go further. Now let us begin. Chapter 1. The Generous Person Who Starved Their Own Home. There is a particular kind of person that most communities have known at some point. The person everyone calls when something needs to be done. The one who shows up for the school fundraiser, organizes the neighborhood initiative, volunteers on weekends, and always seems to have time and energy for whoever asks. They are admired, and they are depended upon. Their generosity is spoken of warmly and genuinely, because it is real. They are not performing. They care. They show up, and the world around them is genuinely better for their presence in it. But go home with them. Sit in their kitchen on a Tuesday evening. Watch the quality of attention they bring to the conversation with their spouse after a long day of giving to everyone else. Notice the way their children have learned to wait, not impatiently, but with the particular resignation of people who have understood, without it ever being said directly, that they are not first, that the parent who is endlessly available to others arrives home already empty, that the partner who is celebrated for their generosity outside the house has very little of it left when the door closes. This is not a rare situation. It is, in fact, one of the most common forms of relational neglect that exists, and it is invisible precisely because it is wrapped in something that looks like virtue. The person living it rarely identifies what is happening as neglect, because neglect implies indifference, and they are not indifferent. They care deeply about the people at home. They intend to be present. They plan regularly and sincerely to give more to the people closest to them. The intention is genuine, but intention without the structural commitment that turns it into consistent behavior remains exactly what it is, an intention. And intentions do not raise children, sustain marriages, or build the quality of connection that the people who share your life actually need from you. The psychology behind this pattern is worth examining carefully. Why? Because understanding it is the first step toward genuinely changing it. The person who gives most generously outside the home and least consistently within it is almost never doing so out of a conscious hierarchy of priorities in which family ranks low. They are doing so because of something more subtle and more psychologically interesting than simple neglect. They are doing so because external giving tends to be immediately and visibly rewarded in ways that domestic giving is not. When you show up for the community, you receive gratitude. You receive recognition. You receive the warm, immediate confirmation that your presence mattered and your contribution was valued. This feedback loop is powerful. It is reinforcing in the most direct psychological sense. The behavior is followed by a positive response, in which makes the behavior more likely to be repeated. Over time, the person becomes increasingly drawn to the context in which their giving produces this clear, warm, external validation, and increasingly less present in the context, home, family, The intimate relationships of a daily life, where the giving is expected rather than celebrated, where it is the baseline rather than the exceptional, where it produces not gratitude, but simply the functioning of a life that depends on it. This is not selfishness in the conventional sense. It is the entirely human tendency to be pulled toward the experiences that make us feel effective and valued, and away from the experiences that feel like ordinary obligation. But it is a tendency with a cost, and the cost is paid not by the person engaging in the pattern, who is, after all, out in the world feeling useful and appreciated, but by the people at home who are receiving the remainder of a person who gave their best hours and their best energy and their most present attention to everyone except them. Consider a woman named Margaret. She had spent 20 years building a reputation as one of the most committed volunteers in her city. Her name was on boards. Her number was in the phones of people who needed things done. She was, in every meaningful external sense, a woman of extraordinary generosity and consistent service, and she was proud of this, legitimately so. The contributions she had made were real. The difference she had helped create in her community was genuine. But her daughter, now grown, described growing up with Margaret in a way that quietly contradicted the public portrait. She described a childhood in which her mother was always available for everyone else, in which the school play was attended, but the conversation after it was brief because there was a call to return and a commitment the following morning, in which the house was organized and the needs were met and the practical functions of a family were maintained with competence, but in which the deeper, less functional, harder to schedule needs of genuine presence and genuine connection were consistently rationed against the demands of everything outside the door. Margaret, when her daughter said these things to her, gently years later, in a conversation that had taken considerable courage to begin, did not respond with defensiveness. She was quiet for a long time. And then she said something that contained more self-knowledge than most people manage in a lifetime of less honest living. She said that she had always found it easier to love people she did not have to live with, that the intimacy of home, the daily, unedited, fully exposed intimacy of people who see you in every version of yourself, had always frightened her in a way that the cleaner, more bounded relationships of external service never did. That giving to the community had been, in ways she had never examined before that conversation, a manageable substitute for the more demanding and more vulnerable work of giving fully to the people who knew her most completely. This is the insight that this chapter is ultimately pointing toward. For many people who exhibit the pattern of external generosity alongside domestic scarcity, the pattern is not primarily about time management or competing priorities or the simple arithmetic of a busy life. It is about the relative emotional safety of different kinds of giving. Giving to the world is bounded. You can control the terms of it. You can choose when to show up and when to step back. You can present the version of yourself that is most capable and most composed and most certain of what it is doing. The people you serve in this context know only the parts of you that you choose to show them, and the relationship ends cleanly when the service ends. Giving to the people you live with is not bounded in any of these ways. They know all of you. They have seen your worst days and your weakest moments and the versions of yourself that you would never voluntarily present to the world. They need from you not the composed, capable, publicly generous version, but the actual version, the tired, uncertain, sometimes frustrated, and sometimes tender, and always fully exposed version that cannot be curated or managed or held at the comfortable distance that external generosity permits. This is considerably more demanding, and it is the demand that many generous people, without ever consciously choosing to do so, have found ways to avoid by investing their best capacity in the context where the giving is easier and the exposure is less. Understanding this is not about guilt, it is about clarity. Because the person who understands why they give more readily outside the home than within it has access to a choice that the person without that understanding does not have. They can see the pattern. They can examine the fear or the discomfort or the unconscious preference for bounded giving that is driving it. And they can make a deliberate, conscious, genuinely informed decision about whether the pattern serves the life they actually want to be living, whether the reputation for generosity in the world is worth the quiet cost of its relative absence, in the place where cost is most directly felt by the people who matter most. The question this chapter leaves you with is not whether you're a generous person. You almost certainly are in the ways that the world measures generosity. The question is whether the generosity you are known for in the world is matched or exceeded by the generosity you practice in the rooms where no one is keeping score. In the daily, unspectacular, an entirely unglamorous giving of your actual presence to the people who share your life and who need from you not your best public self, but your most honest, most available, most genuinely invested private one. That is the giving that this audiobook is about. Not the giving that earns applause, the giving that builds a life. Chapter 2. What home actually needs from you. There is a version of presence that most people mistake for the real thing because it occupies the same physical space. The body is there. The person is in the house, at the table, in the room. They are not elsewhere in any literal sense, but something essential is missing, something that the people sharing that space feel with a clarity that they often cannot articulate, but that shapes in accumulating ways. And the quality of their experience of home and their experience of the person who is physically present, but not genuinely there. This is the phenomenon of occupied absence, being somewhere without actually being there. And it is one of the most common and most quietly damaging features of modern domestic life. The phone on the table that pulls attention away from the conversation in increments small enough to be individually dismissible, but collectively significant. The mental residue of work that follows a person through the front door and sits at the dinner table as surely as any physical guest. The habitual half-engagement that develops in people who have spent years giving their full attention elsewhere and bringing what remains to the people at home. Home does not primarily need your money, though financial security matters. Why, it does not primarily need your organizational competence, though the management of a shared life requires real effort. It does not primarily need the grand gestures of occasional special attention that punctuate the ordinary weeks with enough warmth to sustain the illusion of genuine connection. What home needs, what the people who share your life are genuinely hungry for, often without the language to say so directly, is your actual presence. The quality of attention that says, without words, that this moment and this person are receiving the real you, rather than the remainder of you. This quality of presence is not passive. It is not the simple absence of distraction. Though removing distraction is part of it, it is an active orientation, a deliberate turning of your full attention, your genuine curiosity, your honest engagement toward the person in front of you and the life unfolding around you. It is the difference between hearing and listening, between being in the room and being with the person, between fulfilling the functional requirements of domestic life and actually inhabiting it. A man named Robert had been married for 14 years before his wife said something that stopped him in a way that nothing before it had managed to do. She did not say it dramatically. She said it quietly, in the way that people say things they have been carrying for a long time and have finally decided, with a mixture of exhaustion and courage, to put down. She said that she felt like she was living with someone who was always about to be present, always just finishing the last thing, always almost done, and always on the verge of the attention that never quite fully arrived. She said she had spent 14 years waiting for him to show up in the way she had always believed he was capable of showing up, and that she was tired of waiting for something she was no longer sure he knew how to give. Robert heard this, and his first response, internal and immediate, was defense. He provided. He showed up in every practical sense. He was faithful and responsible and genuinely committed to the marriage in every way he could point to and name. But underneath the defense, if he was honest, and he sat with the honesty for a long time before he was willing to acknowledge it, he knew she was right. He had been present in every functional sense and absent in the one sense that she was describing, the sense that matters most, the sense of being genuinely, fully, unhurriedly available to another person in the ordinary moments of a shared life. What had taken his presence so completely? Not malice, not indifference. The accumulated weight of a professional life that had never developed a genuine boundary between itself and the personal one. The habit of mental occupation that had grown unchallenged over years of treating every available moment as a moment that could be used productively. The particular modern condition of always being reachable, always being needed by someone somewhere, that had made genuine disengagement from the external world feel increasingly like an option rather than a necessity. Robert's situation is not exceptional. It is the ordinary condition of a significant proportion of people living in modern households. People who are technically present in their homes and genuinely absent from them in the ways that their families most need. And the cost of this absence is not always announced. It accumulates quietly in the slow erosion of intimacy that happens when presence is consistently partial, in the growing distance between people who share a physical space but rarely share the genuine attention that makes a shared space into a genuine home. What home actually needs from you begins with understanding what genuine presence requires. And the first thing it requires is the willingness to be finished. Not permanently finished, not available at the expense of every professional and personal responsibility outside the home. But finished in the specific sense of being able to transition genuinely, cleanly, with full intention, from the mode of external engagement to the mode of domestic presence. The ability to close the door on what was happening before you walk through it and to arrive, actually arrive, in the life that is waiting for you on the other side. This transition is not automatic for most people, and it does not happen simply by changing physical location. It requires a deliberate practice, something that marks the boundary between the external world and the domestic one, that signals to the nervous system and to the mind that the mode of engagement is changing. For some people, this practice is physical, a walk, a period of deliberate stillness before entering the house, a specific ritual of transition that creates the psychological separation the mind needs to genuinely shift modes. For others, it is more internal, a conscious decision made at the threshold to leave the day's unfinished business at the door and to bring the full weight of their attention to what is inside. The specific form of the practice matters less than its consistency. What matters is that the transition is real rather than nominal, that you are not simply relocating your body while carrying your mind somewhere else entirely, that when you arrive at home, you are actually arriving, not just parking. The second thing that home needs from you is the quality of attention that treats the ordinary as significant. This is perhaps the deepest shift that genuine domestic presence requires. Because it runs directly against the grain of a culture that is organized around the exceptional. We are trained by almost everything that surrounds us to reserve our best attention for the significant moments, the milestones, the crises, the occasions that announce themselves as worthy of genuine investment. And we are trained, equally and oppositely, to manage the ordinary efficiently, to move through the unremarkable hours of a domestic day with the minimal engagement required to keep things functioning. But home is made almost entirely of the ordinary. The dinner table conversation about nothing in particular. The child's account of a school day that contains no milestone and no crisis, and that matters enormously to the child and almost not at all to the efficiency-oriented adult who is half listening. On the quiet evening beside a partner that does not need to produce anything or go anywhere, and that is, in its unproductiveness, one of the most valuable things two people can share. These ordinary moments are not the filler between the significant ones. They are the actual substance of a shared life, and the person who brings genuine presence to them, who treats the unremarkable conversation with the quality of attention that most people reserve for the important meeting, is building something in the daily texture of their home that no amount of occasional grand gesture can substitute for. A woman named Helen understood this after a period of honest reflection following her mother's death. In the months of grief that followed, she found herself returning repeatedly to memories that surprised her with their ordinariness. Not the significant occasions, the birthdays, the holidays, the milestone events that she had always assumed would be the content of grief. She found herself returning to the ordinary afternoons, the way her mother would stop what she was doing when Helen walked into the room, genuinely stop, not pause while continuing to think about something else, but actually stop and turn and give her full attention as if Helen's arrival was the thing she had been waiting for. The quality of that attention, available in the unremarkable moments of an ordinary day, was what grief kept returning her to, because it was what she had felt most fully seen by, and it was what she most wanted to learn to give. Home also needs from you the honesty of your actual self, not the managed, composed, publicly presentable version that most people default to in contexts where they feel observed and evaluated. The actual version, tired when you are tired, uncertain when you are uncertain, in need of care when you are in need of care. This honesty is both a gift to the people you live with and a form of genuine intimacy that occupied absence makes impossible. Because you cannot be truly close to a person who is always presenting a managed version of themselves, however capable and however pleasant that version might be. Closeness requires the exposure of the actual, and the actual includes the difficult parts that the public self has learned to conceal. The home that receives your honest self, the one in which you do not maintain the performance of having it together when you do not, and in which you ask for what you need rather than managing your neediness in private, in which the people who share your life are trusted with the full range of who you actually are, is a home that functions as genuine sanctuary rather than another performance venue. And the people in that home develop, through the experience of being trusted with your actual self, a quality of understanding and of intimacy that the managed version of presence can never produce. There is a final dimension of what home needs from you that is perhaps the most practically challenging because it requires the redistribution of a resource that modern life consistently overallocates to the external world. It is the resource of your best energy, not the remainder, not the end-of-day residue of a person who has given their most alert, most creative, most genuinely present hours to everything and everyone outside the home. The actual best, the quality of engagement that you bring to the professional situations that you consider most important, redirected consistently and deliberately toward the people in the life that are most important in the fuller sense of that word. This redistribution is not about abandoning professional commitment or pretending that the demands of a working life are not real. They are real and they are legitimate. But most people, if they examine honestly the actual allocation of their best cognitive and emotional energy across a typical day, will find that the distribution has drifted, through years of unreflective habit, significantly toward the external and significantly away from the domestic. Not because they chose this distribution deliberately, but because external demands are louder and more immediately insistent than domestic ones, and the path of least resistance, followed consistently enough, becomes the path that defines how the hours of a life are actually spent. Rebalancing this distribution does not require a revolution in your professional life. It requires a series of deliberate, consistent, smaller choices about when the phone goes away, about which hours of the day are protected for the people at home, about the quality of attention you consciously choose to bring to the domestic moments that used to receive whatever was left. These choices, made consistently over weeks and months, change the felt reality of home in ways that are noticed long before they are named. In the quality of the conversations, in the ease of the relationships, in the particular warmth that develops in a household in which the people feel genuinely seen and genuinely prioritized rather than genuinely loved, but practically deprioritized. Home needs your presence, your honest self, your best energy redistributed toward the people and the life that represent your deepest investments, and your willingness to treat the ordinary moments of a shared life as the significant events they actually are. Not because every Tuesday evening is remarkable, but because the person sitting across from you at the Tuesday evening table is. That is what charity beginning at home actually looks like in practice. Not the dramatic gesture, the consistent, ordinary, entirely unglamorous gift of actually being there. Chapter 3, the family you build when you actually show up. There is a difference between a household and a home that has nothing to do with its physical contents. A household is a functional unit, people sharing a space, managing shared responsibilities, navigating the practical logistics of a life lived in proximity. It operates. It produces the outputs that a family requires. The bills are paid, the meals are made, the children get to school and back, and the visible structure of a shared life is maintained with sufficient competence to give it the appearance of health from the outside. Many households do this reliably, even impressively, and the people living in them would describe their family as fine, functioning, stable, not in crisis. A home is something more than this. It is a place where the people inside it feel genuinely known, where the relationships have depth rather than just duration, where the daily experience of being there carries a quality of safety and warmth that does not depend on everything going well, but on the reliable presence of people who are genuinely invested in each other, not just practically, not just functionally, but in the full, honest, emotionally present way that turns a group of people sharing an address into a family in the truest sense of the word. The difference between a household and a home is built not in the exceptional moments, but in the accumulated quality of the ordinary ones. It is built through the consistent, daily, in unremarkable practice of actually showing up, of being genuinely present to the people you live with in the ways that this audiobook has been describing. And what gets built through that practice over months and years of genuine investment is something that cannot be purchased, cannot be constructed through occasional grand gestures, and cannot be retroactively installed once the children are grown or the marriage has drifted beyond the point where casual repair is possible. What gets built is trust, not the trust of a formal commitment or a stated intention, but the operational trust of people who have learned, through direct and repeated experience, that you are reliably there, that your attention is genuinely available rather than theoretically allocated. That the person they need when things are difficult or uncertain or simply ordinary is the person who will actually show up rather than the person who will mean to show up and be unavoidably delayed by everything else that is always also demanding attention. This trust is the foundation of everything that a family at its best is capable of being. It is the ground from which children develop the security that allows them to explore the world without being paralyzed by it. The internalized confidence that comes not from being told they are loved, but from the lived, repeated, embodied experience of being consistently attended to. Or it is the ground from which a marriage or a partnership develops the depth that sustains it through the inevitable seasons of difficulty, the accumulated relational capital of years of genuine presence that makes the hard seasons navigable because the foundation is solid enough to bear the weight. Consider a father named David who made a decision when his children were young that most of his colleagues considered impractical, and that he himself sometimes doubted in the seasons when its costs were most visible. He decided that the hours between 5 in the evening and 8 at night were his children's hours, not in the sense of a rigid rule that could not flex for genuine necessity, but in the sense of a genuine, consistently honored commitment that those hours were theirs rather than his. His phone went into a drawer. His work stayed at work in every sense that he could manage, and he gave those hours, 3 hours on an ordinary evening, the most ordinary hours of an ordinary day, the quality of his actual presence rather than the presence of a man whose body was home while his mind remained elsewhere. What he built in those 3 hours per evening, accumulated over the years of his children's growing up, was a quality of relationship with them that he describes as the most significant achievement of his life. Not because the hours were always remarkable, they were rarely remarkable. Homework help and dinner conversations and the television shows they watched together and the drives to activities and back. The unremarkable texture of a family life. But the unremarkable texture was inhabited. He was actually there. And his children grew up inside the experience of a parent who was actually there, which shaped them in ways that the developmental research on parental presence consistently confirms. In their confidence, in their capacity for genuine relationship, in their internalized sense of their own worth as people whose presence in the world merited genuine adult attention. David's wife described something different, but related when she spoke about the same years. She described the quality of their marriage during that period as something that developed a depth she had not anticipated when they were first together. Not because they had fewer conflicts or less difficulty, they had the ordinary share of both. But because the practice of genuine presence that David was bringing to his parenting was also, she noticed gradually and then more clearly, the practice he was bringing to their relationship. The same quality of actual attention, the same willingness to be finished with everything else when the moment called for it, the same orientation toward the people in his home as the primary rather than the residual recipients of his genuine investment. This is one of the things that genuine domestic presence does that most people do not fully anticipate when they begin the practice. It does not stay contained in the specific context where it is being consciously applied. It changes the quality of the person applying it in ways that gradually express themselves across all the relationships in that person's home. Because presence is not a technique, it is an orientation. And an orientation, once genuinely developed, or does not turn on and off according to the specific relationship it was originally developed for. It becomes the way you are. The quality of attention you bring to the people around you. The standard of genuine engagement that has replaced the habitual partial attention of a person who had never examined what they were giving and what it was producing. What a family builds when the people in it actually show up for each other consistently is also a specific quality of communication that is qualitatively different from the communication of households where genuine presence is intermittent. In the home where presence is reliable, conversation develops a depth and an honesty that is not possible in the home where people have learned through repeated experience. While that full disclosure is risky because the attention required to receive it may not be available. Children in homes where they have been consistently attended to do not hide the things that matter. Not because they have been instructed to be open or because honesty has been explicitly encouraged as a family value, but because the experience of being genuinely listened to, of bringing something important or difficult or uncertain to a parent, and having that parent actually stop and actually engage with full attention and genuine care, teaches them in the most direct and embodied way possible that this is what this relationship is for, that this is a place where the important things can be brought and will be received, that the person they are bringing it to is capable of being present for it. And this is one of the most significant things that genuine domestic presence protects against. the drift toward performance that happens in families where presence is unreliable, where children learn to present their acceptable selves and conceal their struggling ones, not because anyone told them to, but because the struggling self requires a quality of attention that experience has taught them is not consistently available, where partners learn to manage their actual emotional reality privately rather than sharing it, because the sharing requires a quality of genuine response that the occupied absent person cannot reliably provide, where the household continues to function and the family continues to look fine from the outside, while the interior life of the relationships gradually contracts into something significantly smaller and less honest than what it could have been. The family you build when you actually show up is not a family without difficulty. It is a family with the relational resources to navigate difficulty honestly. It is a family in which the hard conversations can actually happen because the foundation of genuine presence makes them safe enough to attempt, in which the children can bring their failures as readily as their successes because the attention available to them is not conditional on presenting only the acceptable version, in which the partners can be honest about what they are struggling with because the relationship has the depth that sustained genuine presence builds, the depth that makes vulnerability possible because the foundation it rests on has been consistently and deliberately constructed rather than assumed. There is also something that genuine domestic presence does to the atmosphere of a home that is felt before it is understood, a quality of ease and warmth that visitors notice and that the people living inside it often take for granted until they spend time in a household where it is absent. It is the atmosphere produced by people who are genuinely comfortable with each other in the specific way that comes from being genuinely known by each other, who have spent enough real time and real presence with each other that the social performance that characterizes most human interaction has been worn away, leaving something more honest and more comfortable in its place. This atmosphere does not develop through the weekend family trip or the annual holiday or the occasional special evening that is meant to compensate for the ordinary weeks of occupied absence. It develops through the ordinary weeks themselves, through the Tuesday evenings and the Saturday mornings, and the unremarkable car rides and the dinners that go nowhere in particular, and the quiet, companionable evenings that do not produce anything except the simple, deeply human experience of being in the presence of people who are actually there with you. A building this requires the same thing that every genuinely valuable thing requires: consistent investment over time, in the absence of immediate dramatic returns, with the patience of someone who understands that what they are building does not announce itself in the early stages, but becomes, over years of genuine investment, among the most durable and most deeply valuable things a person can construct in the course of a human life. The family built through genuine presence is not perfect. It contains the full range of human difficulty, conflict and misunderstanding, and seasons of distance, and the ordinary failures of people who are trying to live together honestly without always succeeding. But it has resources that the household built on occupied absence does not have. It has the relational depth that comes from years of genuine investment, the trust that accumulates through consistent presence, the honesty that develops in the space that genuine attention creates, and the particular, irreplaceable quality of a family in which the people inside it know, not from being told, but from the direct, repeated, embodied experience of daily life together, that they genuinely matter to the people they live with. That knowledge, felt rather than stated, built rather than declared, is what genuine domestic presence ultimately constructs. And it is, in the full accounting of a human life, among the most significant things you will ever build. Show up for it, consistently, in the ordinary moments, before the extraordinary ones make it urgent. To Chapter 4. Giving to yourself is not selfishness. There is a belief, held quietly and rarely examined, that runs through the lives of many generous and conscientious people like a fault line through solid ground. It is the belief that attending to your own needs, your own rest, your own interior life and emotional well-being is a form of selfishness, that the time and energy spent on yourself is time and energy taken from the people who need you, and that the genuinely good person minimizes this self-directed investment in favor of maximum availability to others. This belief is rarely stated explicitly because stated explicitly, it sounds obviously wrong, but it operates implicitly in the behavior of a significant proportion of people who consistently deprioritize their own needs, and many who treat rest as something earned rather than required, who feel a specific and persistent guilt when they are not productive or available or useful to someone, and who have built their sense of worth so thoroughly around their function for others that the question of what they need for themselves has become genuinely difficult to answer. This belief is not only psychologically damaging, it is practically counterproductive, because the person who does not attend to themselves, who does not rest adequately, who does not process their own emotional experience, who does not maintain the interior conditions that genuine presence and genuine giving require, does not actually give more to the people around them by neglecting themselves. They give less. They give the diminished, depleted, but an increasingly hollow output of a person who has been withdrawing from their own reserves without replenishment for long enough that the reserves are no longer adequate to the demands being made on them. The metaphor most commonly used to describe this dynamic is the aircraft instruction about oxygen mass, that you must secure your own before assisting others, not because your oxygen matters more than the person beside you, but because your capacity to assist them depends entirely on your own ability to function. This metaphor is so familiar that it has lost some of its force through repetition, but it remains precisely accurate as a description of the practical logic of self-care as a prerequisite for genuine service. You cannot give from empty. You cannot be genuinely present for other people when your own interior life is depleted, and unprocessed, or running on the fumes of a system that has not been adequately maintained. The charity that begins at home includes, necessarily and fundamentally, the charity you extend to yourself, the compassion you bring to your own limitations, the rest you allow yourself without guilt, the honest attention you give to your own emotional and psychological needs rather than managing them past in the urgency of being useful to everyone else. This is not self-indulgence. It is the foundational practice of sustainable giving, the maintenance of the person that all the other giving depends upon. A woman named Nadia had spent the better part of a decade being indispensable to her employer, to her children, to her aging parents, or to her friends who called when things were difficult, because Nadia was always available and always capable and always had something useful to offer. She was not performing her helpfulness. It was genuine. She cared about the people she was available to, and the caring was real. But underneath the availability in the private interior of a person who had never quite made peace with the idea that her own needs were legitimate, something was quietly depleting. She did not recognize it as depletion for a long time because she had become expert at the particular skill of keeping the output consistent while the reserves declined. She knew how to appear fine when she was not fine. She knew how to produce the warmth and the capability and the genuine engagement that people expected from her, even when the production required more effort than anyone around her would have believed. And she told herself in the moments when she noticed the gap between the effort and the ease, that this was simply what it meant to be a responsible adult with real commitments, that the difficulty was normal and the exhaustion was deserved, and the need she occasionally felt to stop and be attended to herself was an indulgence she had not yet earned. The cost of this arrived not in a single dramatic event, but in the gradual erosion of the quality of everything she was giving. The presence became thinner, the patience shorter, The warmth that had always been natural began to require conscious effort, and conscious effort, was sustained long enough, produces a quality of engagement that the people receiving it eventually begin to sense is different from the natural version. More effortful, less easy, more like a performance of care than the genuine article that preceded it. Her children noticed first in the way that children notice everything, in the slight change of texture in the evenings, the way patience arrived a beat later than it used to, the quality of tiredness in their mother that felt different from the ordinary tiredness of a busy day. What Nadia eventually understood, through a conversation with a friend who cared enough to say a difficult thing directly, was that the depletion she was experiencing was not a consequence of giving too much. It was a consequence of giving without replenishment. It of treating the maintenance of her own interior as a luxury to be scheduled after everything else, rather than as the prerequisite that made everything else possible. The friend said something that Nadia returned to many times in the years following. She said that the most generous thing Nadia could do for the people who needed her was to stop treating her own needs as the last item on a list that never got short enough to reach them. The practice of genuine self-care, which is a phrase so thoroughly colonized by its commercial associations that it requires reclaiming in its more serious and more fundamental sense, begins with the honest acknowledgement that you are a person with needs, and that those needs are not an inconvenience to be managed, but a legitimate reality to be attended to. Not every need, not without limit, and not at the expense of genuine responsibility to the people who depend on you, but honestly, regularly, with the same quality of genuine attention that you bring to the needs of the people you care for. What does this actually look like in practice? It looks like rest that is not preceded by the completion of every outstanding task, because the outstanding tasks are never all completed, and waiting for their completion means waiting forever. It looks like the honest acknowledgement of your own emotional state rather than the management of it past in the service of continued function. It looks like protecting the time and the conditions that allow your interior life to be maintained, whatever those conditions are for you specifically, and whether that is solitude or movement or creative expression, or the quality of conversation that feeds rather than drains, or some combination of all of these and more. It also looks like the development of what might be called an honest relationship with your own limits. Most people who struggle with self-care struggle less with the practical dimension of it than with the psychological one, with the internalized belief that their limits are a failure rather than a fact, that needing rest or support or time for themselves is evidence of inadequacy rather than evidence of being human. This belief, where it exists, must be examined and addressed before the practical dimensions of self-care become genuinely sustainable. Because a person who believes that their needs are a problem will consistently find ways to minimize or deny those needs, even when the practical time and space for attending to them is available. The examination of this belief begins with the honest question of where it came from. For many people, the belief that self-care is selfishness was absorbed in childhood, from environments where need was treated as burden, where the adults who modeled life for them demonstrated through their own behavior that the right response to personal need was to suppress it and continue functioning. These early models are powerful in the specific way that absorbed rather than chosen beliefs are powerful. They operate beneath the threshold of conscious examination, shaping behavior through the emotional weight of something that was learned before the person had the capacity to evaluate whether it was true. Understanding where the belief came from does not automatically dissolve it, but it does something important. It relocates it from the category of objective truth to the category of inherited assumption. And inherited assumptions, once identified as such, can be examined, questioned, and where necessary replaced with something more honest and more useful. The more honest and more useful belief in this case is something like this. Attending to yourself is not selfishness. It is stewardship. You are the resource that everyone who depends on you depends upon. The maintenance of that resource is not a personal indulgence. It is a responsibility to yourself and to every person whose well-being is in any way connected to your capacity to be genuinely present and genuinely available. There is a deeper dimension of this chapter that deserves direct attention because it goes beyond the practical logic of self-maintenance and into something more fundamental about what genuine charity, genuine, sustainable, deep-rooted generosity actually requires at its source. The person who gives from fullness gives differently than the person who gives from obligation or from the managed remainder of a depleted system. They give with a quality of freedom and genuine warmth that the depleted giver cannot access because the giving is not costing them something they cannot afford. It is flowing from a genuine abundance that has been tended and maintained and allowed to replenish. An abundance that is not financial, but interior, not material, but human, not the abundance of having more than enough stuff, but the abundance of being more than adequately present to your own life. This interior abundance is what genuine self-care cultivates, not the Instagram version of self-care, the bubble bath and the scented candle and the weekend away. Though rest and pleasure are legitimate parts of a full human life and should not be dismissed, but the deeper, more consistent, more genuinely restorative practice of attending to your own interior with the same quality of honest care that you bring to the people you love, of asking yourself regularly and without the guilt that makes the question difficult to sit with honestly, what you actually need. And then, to the degree that genuine responsibility permits, giving it to yourself. Because the person who has learned to give honestly to themselves, who has developed the capacity to attend to their own needs without guilt, and to replenish their own reserves without the belief that doing so is a theft from others, is the person who can give most genuinely to the people around them. Not the loudest giver, not the most visibly self-sacrificing, not the person most celebrated for their availability, but the person whose giving is sustainable, whose presence is genuine rather than effortful, whose warmth is natural rather than performed, whose care for the people they love is fed from a source that has been tended rather than drawn from a well that is quietly running dry. Give to yourself, not instead of giving to others, as the foundation of giving to others, as the practice that makes everything else possible, as the most honest and most durable form of the charity that this audiobook has been saying, from the beginning, must begin at home. And home includes you. Chapter 5, when you fix the foundation, everything built on it changes. There is a particular moment that many people describe when they look back at the period in which they genuinely changed. Not the surface change of behavior modification or the temporary change of a good intention, briefly sustained, but the deep, structural, durable change that alters the quality of everything built upon it. The moment is rarely dramatic. It does not usually announce itself as significant in the instant it occurs. It is often quiet, sometimes uncomfortable, and frequently arrived at through a period of honest examination that was more difficult than the change itself. But it shares across the enormously varied circumstances of the people who describe it a common quality. It is the moment of recognizing that the problem was not where they had been looking for it. They had been trying to improve the outputs, the behavior, the results, the quality of the relationships, the texture of the daily life, without examining the foundation those outputs were being generated from. They had been repainting walls on a structure whose ground had shifted, rearranging the rooms of a house whose foundation was compromised, working hard on the visible surfaces of a life while the invisible base of it, the interior conditions, the unexamined beliefs, the habitual patterns of self-neglect and external performance that this audiobook has been tracing, remained unaddressed and therefore continued, regardless of the surface effort being applied, to generate the same fundamental outputs in new forms. The foundation in the context of everything this audiobook has been exploring is the quality of your relationship with yourself and with the life immediately around you. The honesty of your self-knowledge, the genuineness of your presence in your own home, the sustainability of the giving you do, whether it flows from genuine fullness or from the managed depletion of a person who has never examined the true cost of their generosity. When this foundation is solid, when the interior conditions are honestly maintained, when the home is receiving genuine presence rather than occupied absence, when the self is being attended to with the same quality of care extended to others, everything built upon it changes in ways that are both practical and profound. The first change that a solid foundation produces is a change in the quality of your external giving. This may seem counterintuitive because one of the fears that stops people from investing more in their home and themselves is the belief that doing so will reduce what they have available for the world. That the energy redirected toward the interior, toward the home, the family, the self, is energy subtracted from the external contributions that define their sense of purpose and worth. This fear is understandable, but it is not accurate. What actually happens, for people who genuinely fix the foundation, is that the quality of what they offer the world improves rather than diminishes. Because the giving that flows from a genuinely maintained interior is different in character from the giving that flows from a depleted one. It is more honest, less driven by the unconscious need for external validation that often motivates the excessive outward generosity of people whose home life is giving them less than they need, less compulsive, less performance-oriented, less shaped by the emotional needs that the giving is unconsciously designed to address. More genuinely free, chosen rather than driven, offered from a place of actual abundance rather than borrowed against a reserve that cannot sustain the borrowing indefinitely. The person who has fixed their foundation gives to the world not because the world's response is the primary source of their sense of worth, but because they have enough interior stability, enough genuine connection at home, enough of their own needs met, that the giving is an expression of genuine care rather than an unconscious strategy for getting something that home is not providing. A man named Richard had been involved in charitable work for most of his adult life, driven by a genuine commitment to the causes he supported and, as he eventually came to understand, by something else alongside the genuine commitment. Something that had needed the recognition and the sense of effectiveness that the work provided in ways that the interior of his life was not adequately supplying. When he was not conscious of this dual motivation for years, he experienced his external giving as purely altruistic because the need it was also serving was invisible to him. Invisible because examining it would have required a quality of honest self-reflection that he had consistently avoided. When he finally examined it, when the honest conversation with himself that he had been deferring for years finally happened, prompted by a crisis in his marriage that made continued avoidance impossible, what he found was not comfortable. He found that a significant portion of the energy he had been investing in the world was energy that his home should have been receiving, that the sense of competence and worth and warm recognition that he had been seeking externally was a need that, had it been addressed honestly in the interior of his life, would not have required the compulsive external seeking that had characterized his giving for years. He did not stop his charitable work. He changed its quality. He fixed the foundation, did the genuine, uncomfortable, sometimes slow work of addressing the interior conditions that had been generating the compulsive outward seeking. And the work he continued to do in the world became, over time, something noticeably different, more present, less driven, more genuinely about the people it was intended to serve, and less about the emotional function it was serving for him. The people he worked with noticed the change without always being able to name it. What they noticed was the quality of his attention, The way it had become more genuinely available, less performing, more honestly in service of what was actually needed rather than what made him feel most effective. The second change that a fixed foundation produces is a change in the relational quality of every significant connection in your life. Not only the domestic ones, though those are where the change is most immediately and most deeply felt, but the broader relational world that your life contains. Because the quality of presence and genuine attention that develops through the practice of genuine domestic investment does not stay confined to the home. It becomes the quality of attention you bring to everything. The colleague who needed to be genuinely heard rather than efficiently processed. The friend whose difficulty required actual engagement rather than the competent delivery of useful advice. The stranger whose humanity merited more than the minimal acknowledgement that occupied presence provides. The person who has developed the capacity for genuine presence at home carries that capacity into every context they enter, not because they made a decision to be more present everywhere, but because genuine presence, once developed as an interior orientation rather than a situational technique, expresses itself naturally across the full range of a person's relational life. The orientation changes, and an orientation by definition shapes everything you are oriented toward. The third change is perhaps the most significant and the most difficult to fully convey because it operates at the level of meaning rather than behavior. It is the change that happens in the felt quality of a person's relationship with their own life when the foundation is genuinely solid. The sense, not performed, not insisted upon, but genuinely felt in the daily texture of a life that has been honestly attended to, that the life being lived is actually worth living. Not in the grand philosophical sense of existential justification, but in the immediate, practical, daily sense of a person who wakes in the morning to a life that feels genuinely inhabited rather than managed, that feels connected rather than isolated, that feels in the specific and humble way of someone whose interior and exterior are no longer in significant conflict, like theirs. This quality of felt ownership over one's own life is more rare than it should be. Many people live inside lives that are objectively successful, well-resourced, socially connected, practically functional, while feeling, in the private interior of their daily experience, a persistent sense of distance from their own existence, of going through motions, of being present in the technical sense while absent in the way that matters most, absent from genuine contact with the life they are inside. This distance is the product of the unattended foundation, of the gap between the external performance and the interior reality that has never been honestly addressed. Fix the foundation and the distance closes. Not all at once, not without the ongoing investment that genuine interior maintenance requires, but progressively and genuinely. The life begins to feel like yours because you have begun to actually live inside it, not performing it from a slight remove, not managing it from the outside in, but inhabiting it with the full, present, genuinely engaged attention of a person whose interior conditions are honest enough to permit that level of contact with their own existence. A woman named Patricia described this shift in terms that were simple and precise. She said that for most of her adult life, she had felt like a very capable visitor in her own existence, that she had moved through her days with competence and often with genuine satisfaction in specific moments, but without the sustained underlying sense of actually being at home in her own life. When she did the work, the honest, slow, sometimes uncomfortable work of fixing the foundation, or of genuinely attending to herself and to the people in the life closest to her, she described what changed as something she found difficult to name without it sounding trivial. She said she started feeling at home, not in the house, though the quality of the house changed too, in the life, in the daily, ordinary, entirely unremarkable experience of being herself in her existence. She said it was the thing she had not known she was missing because she had never had a name for its absence. Only a vague, persistent sense that something essential was not quite present in a life that had everything else. What she was describing is what becomes available when the foundation is genuinely fixed. Not the dramatic transformation of circumstances, not the resolution of every difficulty, not the arrival of a life without challenge or uncertainty, or the ordinary human difficulty of living in genuine proximity to other people, but the quiet, profound, entirely human experience of a life that is genuinely inhabited by the person living it. A life in which the interior and the exterior are sufficiently aligned that the daily experience of being there feels like presence rather than performance. This is what happens when charity begins at home, when the foundation receives the genuine investment it requires. Everything built on it changes. The giving becomes more honest and more free. The relationships develop the depth that genuine presence builds. The interior experience of a daily life becomes something genuinely worth inhabiting rather than something being managed from a distance. And the person at the center of all of it, the person who did the work of fixing what was underneath everything else, becomes in the quiet, unannounced, entirely genuine way of someone who has actually changed rather than merely improved. Someone whose presence in the world is more honestly and more durably valuable than it was before. Fix the foundation. Chapter 6, A Life That Gives Well, Because It Lives Well. There is an image that stays with people who have genuinely arrived at the place this audiobook has been moving toward. Not as a destination that is fully reached and permanently maintained, but as a quality of living that becomes increasingly available through the patient, honest, ongoing work of genuine interior investment. The image is not dramatic. It is not the image of a person who has solved the fundamental problems of human existence or achieved some elevated state of permanent clarity and peace. It is the image of someone who is simply, genuinely, fully present in their own life, present to the people in it, present to the work of it, present to themselves in the honest, undefended, fully inhabited way of someone who has stopped managing their life from a distance and started actually living it from the inside. This is the destination that everything in this audiobook has been pointing toward. Not a life of perfect generosity or flawless presence or the complete elimination of the patterns and tendencies that this audiobook has been examining, but a life that gives well because it lives well. A life in which the quality of what flows outward, the care, the attention, the genuine investment in other people's well-being, is rooted in and sustained by the quality of what is maintained inward. A life in which charity does not merely begin at home as a preliminary stop on the way to more significant external giving, but in which home, the self, the family, the intimate daily life is understood as the permanent foundation of everything else. To live well, in the sense this chapter is using the phrase, means something specific and something more demanding than the conventional understanding of a good life. It means living with sufficient honesty about yourself that the gap between who you appear to be and who you actually are is narrow enough to be genuinely inhabitable. When it means investing in the relationships closest to you with the same quality of genuine attention that you bring to the things the world evaluates you on. It means attending to your own interior, your needs, your limits, your emotional reality, the specific conditions that allow you to function at the level of genuine presence rather than manage adequacy, with the seriousness of someone who understands that this attendance is not self-indulgence, but the foundational practice of sustainable human service. And it means, perhaps most fundamentally, understanding that the life closest to you is not the consolation prize for the life you are trying to build in the world. It is the life, the actual, primary, most significant arena in which the quality of your character, the depth of your genuine care, and the honesty of your interior development will be most fully expressed and most directly felt by the people whose experience of you matters most. The world will measure your generosity by the visible contributions you make to it, the time you volunteer, the resources you donate, the effort you invest in the causes and the communities and the organizations that your giving supports. These contributions are real and they are genuinely valuable. And this audiobook is not suggesting that they be diminished or abandoned. But the people who share your home will measure your generosity by something the world never sees, by whether you were actually there when you were there, by whether the attention you gave them was genuine rather than managed, by whether the version of you that showed up at the dinner table was the real version or the remainder of a person whose best self had been allocated elsewhere, by whether in the daily, unremarkable, entirely ordinary texture of a life lived together, they felt genuinely known and genuinely prioritized, not in competition with everything else, but as the foundation from which everything else was supported. This is the measure that matters most, not because the world's measure is irrelevant, but because the world's measure is taken at a distance and therefore misses what the close-up measure captures: the actual quality of the human being doing the giving, the actual depth of the care, the actual sustainability of the generosity. Whether it flows from genuine fullness or from the performance of a person who has learned to give impressively while privately running on empty. A man named Thomas arrived at the end of a long and, by any external measure, successful life with a clarity about this distinction that he expressed with the particular precision of someone who has had the time to see the full shape of what they built. He had given generously to the world for decades. His name was on buildings. His contributions were documented and honored and genuinely significant, and he did not regret them. But when he spoke honestly about the life he had lived, the things he returned to with the most evident feeling, with the warmth that is the unmistakable signal of genuine value rather than performed importance, were not the public contributions. They were the private ones. The evenings he had chosen presence over productivity. The conversations he had given his full attention to when half his attention would have been more convenient. The years in which the people closest to him had felt genuinely seen by him rather than generally loved, but practically deprioritized. He said that the thing he most wished he had understood earlier was that the private giving and the public giving were not two separate accounts but one, that the quality of what he gave the world was always downstream of the quality of what he maintained at home, that the years in which he was most genuinely effective in his external contributions were the years in which his interior life and his home life were most honestly attended to, and that the years in which the external giving felt most driven and most compulsive were the years in which he had been most absent from the things that should have been primary, using the world's appreciation as a substitute for the interior stability and genuine domestic connection that he had not yet learned to build and maintain. This insight that the external and the internal are not competing priorities, but a single integrated system in which the interior feeds and sustains the exterior, is the central understanding of everything this audiobook has been building toward. It is the understanding that genuine charity does not begin at home as a preliminary obligation to be discharged before the more significant work of giving to the world begins. It begins at home because home is where the source of genuine giving is maintained or depleted, developed or neglected, sustained or quietly exhausted. And the state of that source, the honest, tended, genuinely maintained interior life from which all giving ultimately flows, determines the quality of everything that flows from it, outward into the world and the people and the causes that your generosity is intended to serve. What does it look like in the practical texture of an ordinary life to live by this understanding rather than merely holding it as an acknowledged truth? It looks like the decisions that are made at the margins of each day, the small, consistent, unglamorous choices that do not individually announce their significance, but that collectively, over months and years. Us build the kind of life that gives well because it lives well. The choice to be finished with work when the people at home need you to be finished, not when everything is done, because everything is never done. The choice to give your genuine attention to the ordinary conversation rather than the managed portion of it that is compatible with also monitoring everything else. The choice to attend to your own needs honestly and without guilt, understanding that the maintenance of your own interior is the prerequisite of sustainable service rather than a competing demand on the resources that service requires. It looks like the courage to be honest about what you are actually experiencing, to bring your genuine self to the people who share your life rather than the curated version that is easiest to present. You to acknowledge when you are struggling rather than managing the struggle privately in the service of continued function. To ask for what you need rather than suppressing the need in the interest of appearing not to have it. To be in the full and ordinary and sometimes difficult sense of the word human with the people who deserve the humanity most. It looks like the patience to build what cannot be rushed, the depth of genuine relationship, the trust of children who have been consistently attended to, the intimacy of a partnership that has been tended through the ordinary seasons as carefully as the significant ones. These things do not develop quickly, and they cannot be manufactured through occasional intense investment following long periods of occupied absence. They develop through the consistent, daily, unremarkable practice of genuine presence across the full span of an ordinary life, through the accumulated thousands of ordinary moments in which the choice was made again and again to actually be there. And it looks like the willingness to let this be enough. To resist the cultural pressure that measures a life by its external achievements and its visible contributions and its publicly recognized generosity, and to hold quietly and firmly the understanding that the most significant thing you will ever build is the quality of the life you live and the quality of the presence you bring to the people inside it. That the person who was genuinely there for their family, who maintained their own interior honestly, who gave to the world from genuine fullness rather than managed depletion, that person built something that the most impressive external contributions cannot substitute for or surpass. You are that person in the making. Not the finished version. No one is ever the finished version. And the work described in this audiobook is not a project with a completion date, but a practice with a daily renewal. But the person who has heard these words and recognized in them something true about their own life in their own patterns, in their own unrealized capacity for a different quality of living. The person who is willing to begin, or to continue, or to recommit, the patient, honest, entirely unglamorous, and entirely essential work of building a life that gives well because it lives well. Begin at home, with yourself, with the people closest to you, with the ordinary moments that are not ordinary at all when they are fully inhabited, with the daily, renewable, entirely available choice to be actually present in the life that is already yours. That is where it begins. And from there, from that solid, honest, genuinely maintained foundation, everything else becomes possible. The giving becomes more genuine. The relationships become more real. The life becomes more fully yours. And the world receives from a person who has learned to live well the kind of generosity that only genuine fullness can produce. Not the performance of abundance, but the real thing, flowing freely, sustainably, from a source that has been honestly tended. This is what happens when charity begins at home. This is what becomes possible when the foundation is built before the giving begins and maintained while the giving continues. This is the life that is available to you, not someday, not when everything else is resolved, but now, in the ordinary moments of an ordinary day, through the entirely accessible and entirely demanding choice to actually be there. Be there. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. If this audiobook has spoken honestly to something in your life, if it has named a pattern you recognize, shifted a perspective you needed shifted, or given you clearer language for a change you already knew needed to happen, please share that. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Pass it along to the person in your life who is giving generously to the world while the people at home wait for what is left. No, and if you have not yet subscribed, do it now. Because the work of building a life that gives well, because it lives well, is ongoing. And so is the content made to support it. Thank you for listening. Now go home and actually be there.